So, as we talked about, the key function of this course is being out doing reports in the real world, doing reporting in the real world, and that means interviewing people. And interviewing people is the best part and sometimes the worst part about being a reporter. It's hard. Sometimes it's really hard to reach out and make that connection with people, to interact with folks in a professional environment, and especially when you're getting started. When I was at when I was in journalism school, we would talk sometimes about phone phobia, about how you just didn't want to pick up the phone and talk to another person. And think about this in terms of the way you approach other things in your life. For some people, especially if you tend to be introverted, then doing interviews can be exhausting. I can remember going out and reporting, from the field for an entire day and getting back to my hotel or wherever I was and just being completely exhausted and needing to crash. But it's absolutely crucial to what you need to do as a reporter. So if it's hard for you, you need to practice, you need to find ways of making it easier. You need to think about your choice of medium. Is it best to do something in person, over the phone, via email, or something else? And we'll talk about different options as we get along through this. And also about being prepared, about having done all of the work at the front end. Honestly, if you've done your work, if you know exactly what you want to talk about, the information you need to get from the person, then it can be easy. Or easy, you can mitigate, you can make it as easy as it's going to get by being prepared, sort of like the Boy Scout motto. So to do your preparing, to do your prep work, you need to find out everything you can about the person, both in the context of the story, but also in context of getting to know who you're talking to, and so that you can be prepared to have a conversation with them, like a real person. Interacting with someone in a professional setting is tough because you never know how personal, how informal to be, or how formal to be. And it's one of those things that there aren't really any rules about. We'll talk a little bit about etiquette here in a little bit, but you've got to be ready for anything. So the more you find out about the person, the better off you're going to be. The other piece here is knowing your story, of knowing exactly what it is that you're trying to write, or at least knowing that you think X or Y, you're not sure which, and you want that person to help you understand which way it is. Talking about etiquette, most of you guys are Southern, and being Southern is one of the greatest assets you can bring into a reporting situation. Because hopefully your mama raised you to say yes ma'am, yes sir, to make eye contact with people, to be polite and thoughtful. And if she didn't, then you need to learn how to fake it. So always ask for an interview. Don't assume that someone's going to talk to you. Recognize that you're not compensating this person, and so whatever time and thought they're going to give you is out of the goodness of their heart. Always keep that front and center in your mind when you're getting into an interview situation. Depending on the circumstances, you may want to specify and ask someone for an in-person interview to sit down and tell them it's going to be for 30 minutes, or ask them if they have time for an hour or whatever the appropriate time ought to be. Or if it's not crucial, like if this is a national expert or someone that you're not necessarily going to be able to talk to face-to-face, let them choose how to discuss things with you. Dress professionally. You don't want to. My basic advice, especially for college students, is just to be preppy. For guys, that usually means khakis and a sport shirt or something like that. For women, I wouldn't try to advise, but just don't show up in running shorts and t-shirts. And usually, even if you're doing something over the phone, it helps to dress up. I mean, this is going to sound bizarre, but if you are personally prepared, then that's going to show when you're talking to somebody, and it's going to affect your mental attitude going into it. As I said, be nice and kind. Always thank people for their time and for their help. Always be gracious to everyone around. Not just the subject you're interviewing, but if they have a secretary or an administrative system, always be nice and thoughtful and engage them in conversations. And again, always make eye contact. Talking about being Southern, adding ma'ams and sirs, it never hurts. Some people will be a little bit freaked out by it, but when you establish a level of rapport, then you can decide when it's right to drop them. But growing up in the South, and when I would talk to people, especially Yankees on the phone, they would always be completely charmed. It works, I'm here to tell you. Ask for stories. Always ask people what their story is, how they got to where they are, how long they've been working on whatever project it is or whatever job it is that you're there talking to them about. If you see something odd, ask how it got there into their office or whatnot. And always thank people for their help and their time at the back end. In terms of how to do interviews, how to set it up, the most important lesson is don't procrastinate. When you realize there's someone you need to talk to, call them up and set up the interview as soon as you possibly can. We'll talk about this again and again, but there are things you can procrastinate about and there are things you cannot procrastinate about when it comes to reporting and writing. And doing interviews is something you absolutely cannot procrastinate on. You have to get that information, because if something goes wrong and it's the day before a story's due, then you're screwed. Pardon my language, but there's just nothing else you can do about it. For the sorts of stories we're going to be doing, and for most other stories you might ever write in your life, it's always preferable to have an in-person conversation, to be able to sit down and have give and take with a person, to see them in their environment, and to hang out with them if you get the chance, especially if you're writing a profile or something like that. But it gives you more chances for a give and take and more of a dialogue, as opposed to simply going down a list of questions or a script and boom, 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 boom. Phone calls do have their advantages. Obviously, you don't have the travel time of getting from point A to point B. And also, if you have your phone and you have your computer out, then you can transcribe their answers immediately. You don't need to get everything exactly right, but it's a lot easier to go back and get information out of notes you've taken on a phone call than out of handwritten notes or recording, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. If someone says, can you just email me questions and I'll send you responses, or if you're trying to do something over Twitter or text message or whatever, the only time that's acceptable is if there are no other forms of contact, if there's no way of doing a face-to-face or a phone interview. And we'll talk in class about why that's true, but for the basics of this, I want you to understand that doing stuff live and spontaneously is always going to be better than doing things where the person has a chance to stop and think about what they're saying. So what do you walk into an interview with? The main thing you need, obviously, is what you want to talk about. And that could take the form of a script, of a list of questions, or it could just be a list of general topics that you want to cover. And it really boils down to your own personal style and how much you feel confident about the story with. When you're in an interview situation, you should always be writing. You should always have the notebook out, even if you're doing a recording. So that you can either write down specific quotes or at least write down ideas or things that are being talked about. And if you're really good, you note what time it is on your recorder so you can go back and find specific quotes or other things. If you are going to use a recorder, in this day and age, that's preferable. Always make sure that you have batteries fresh and that you've got enough memory available on a memory card and that your memory card is working. So I would always test a recorder in enough time to say, oh no, and run to the store to get new batteries or zip to your computer to download whatever on your recorder before you actually start. So bear all of that in mind. I will say very quickly that I never used a recorder, or only once or twice when I had legal situations when I was a reporter. In this day and age, though, I think I probably would use one simply because it's so much easier to store information and keep it. But we'll talk about the pros and cons of that as well. What questions do you ask in an interview situation? There's always the background information, sort of, how things got to be the way they were. And always ask open-ended questions. Ask, why are things the way they were? How did they get there? How did this happen? Who else was involved? Things like that. Don't ask yes or no questions. You're looking for explanations of the particular topic that you happen to be talking about. And also, and I'll confess that this is my greatest weakness as a reporter, I have a tendency to ask questions that show how much I know as opposed to what I want the person to tell me. Sometimes you do have to show that you have done your homework, and that's well and good. But first and foremost, remember to be a witness. Ask the person questions. Get them to explain things to you. And then finally, when we're talking about an in-person interview, get the visual details of their office, of their environment, of wherever you happen to be, and always ask questions about those. Going off the record is really just not a good idea, especially for the kinds of stories you're working on. This is not stuff where you're looking for privileged information And a lot of people tend to get way too excited and tricky about the media and going off the record and telling you stuff so that they can feel like they're an insider providing exclusive information. So it's to be avoided whenever possible. But if you come into a circumstance where you do have someone who wants to talk off the record, you need to specify what that means, because really for the past 30 years since the Watergate scandal, everyone has a different definition of what off the record means. Does it mean something that can be used without attribution? That is something you could print, or a quote that you could use but doesn't have a name attached to it? Is it something that cannot be used at all? That is simply for your information to help direct where you're going with your reporting? Or is it something that a fact that you could use only if you get it confirmed by someone else? One tactic I use if someone says they want to go off the record is just to say, let's just talk, and then when we get to the end of this, let's talk about what I can use and what I can't use. There are perils to doing that, because you're obviously putting yourself at the mercy of who you are talking to. But if their opportunity is to walk away or just hang up the phone on you, then maybe that's not such a bad strategy. And often as not, people figure out that what they want to talk about is not as controversial as they think it is. But bottom line is, just don't go there if you can possibly avoid it. When you talk about how to record stuff, again, always take notes on whatever the situation happens to be. Always have that notebook out. I prefer a steno pad. Other people prefer reporters' notebooks. You have lots of different choices, but always take notes, because you never know what's going to blow up or if your recorder is going to fail or whatever. Using the basic recorders, as we've required you to do, is always a good idea. It's also a good idea to take pictures, even if you're snapping a quick mugshot. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the semester. Some people I've seen now using their iPhones or cameras to record an interview on video. It's not a terrible idea, but you better make sure that you know what you're doing and that you've got good audio quality. Because watching a person talking is not particularly interesting if you can't hear what they're saying. And a lot of times, if you're in a noisy situation, it can be tough to get good audio from either recorder or a video camera. So be aware of that. But always do make note of visual details about someone's office, about where they work, about whatever the environment happens to be. That will always come in useful later on in your stories. When you get done with an interview, always write it up. Either write it up from your notes, or hopefully if you've got it recorded, write down what is said. And do it as quickly as you can, because all of those little details and any vaguenesses in your notes, your visual memory will be the first to fade in your audio memory. And so you need to get all that information onto paper so that you have it. Always make notes if there's something that is not clear on your recording or if it confuses you. And note facts that you need to check, either back with that person or independently. To that point, a little bit further, is the question of accuracy checking. And by accuracy checking, I mean reading quotes back to your source or allowing them to check quotes later. This is very controversial. It's not, a lot of people say you never do this because it gives the source the opportunity to dispute something or raise a problem. But honestly, especially in a professional setting, it's never a bad idea to call back and say, this is what I have you saying, is this what you actually said? You don't give someone the opportunity to change anything, but you either allow them to confirm their information, to confirm the information you've got, or maybe it leads to a better interview where you get a better quote. So that could be possible. It really depends on your own level of confidence in the information you've gotten and whether or not you want to do it. And then the final thing, and we'll talk about this more in class, is when do you correct quotes? When do you take out the ums and the uhs and the bad grammar and stuff like that? This, again, is going to be to your own level of discretion, but what I want you to think about is, when is it relevant to the story and when is it not relevant to a story? If you're talking to an expert and that person says something that comes out kind of mangled, look for something else in your interview. Try to find something where that person has spoken more clearly or made a thought more clearly than you've got. In terms of talking to someone on the street, do you want to embarrass the person by recording exactly what they say and all their malapropisms and everything else, or do you want to get to the essence of what they say? You never want to actually change a quote, but there's a question of what you want to use and what you want to render in another way. And again, we'll talk about that more as the semester goes on. But interviewing, as I said, is absolutely crucial to the work we're going to be doing in class. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. But as always, ask me if you have any questions.